I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose Rapture. A city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, Rapture can become your city as well.
Rapture is a showcase of the eventuality of unbridled capitalism, a city where the government does not interfere with the market and allow the greedy and power-hungry to manipulate the free market to their content, where scientific and medical progress is not hindered by the laws and morality of modern society, where there is only one commandment: do as thou wilt. In the absolutely incredible 2007 immersive sim first-person shooter Bioshock, we get to experience the city after its inevitable downfall as a consequence of this philosophy. An underwater metropolis torn asunder by the very ideas that made it great. Or was it? The game itself paints a rather morbid picture of the rise and fall of Rapture, a war between the haves and the have-nots, ripping the city apart as its citizens lose their minds to the abuse of a substance known as plasmids. But as much as I would love to say the city itself was collateral damage in the fight between Andrew Ryan and his true nemesis Atlas, I think the fall of Rapture is a bit more methodical and deliberate, orchestrated by the very man who built it himself, because very simply, if he can't have it, no one can. To dive deep into this topic, we'll have to get into some spoilers on the game Bioshock. Not storyline spoilers per se, more so world-building spoilers. So if you have not played this game, stop watching this video and go play it, because it is honestly one of the best games ever made. So close YouTube right now and go play Bioshock, because I promise you, it is way better than this video. So like I said, Andrew Ryan, the creator of Rapture, could have been not only directly responsible for, but also purposefully caused the destruction of his once great city, and to really explain why, I think we have to go into pretty great detail about who exactly this guy was. So before he was immortalized as one of the greatest villains of all time, he was born Andrei Ryanovsky in the city of Minsk in modern-day Belarus. At the time, however, it was part of the Russian Empire and on the front lines of the First World War and the Russian Revolution. After the fall of the Tsar and the rise of the Bolsheviks, Ryan and his family witnessed the fall of a mighty empire being replaced by communisms. The Ryanovskys were vocal in their disgust of communism, and this led to the newly empowered Bolsheviks to take action, destroying the family business and killing Ryan's father's cousin and the cousin's wife. In an attempt to save what family remained, Ryan's father took young Andy and fled to Constantinople. It was this experience that gave birth to one of Ryan's most dearly held philosophies, that everything good in the modern world was created by great men who strive tirelessly to make their own way. This philosophy was also paired with his other philosophy of altruism and socialism being the mindset of what he called parasites, people who would take the wealth of such great men and spread to those who he deemed were undeserving. Essentially, that a man is only entitled to what he earned, and what a man earns is his and his alone. In 1919, he fled again, this time to America, where he believed that the country stood by his ideals. That a great man could do great things, unhindered by the overtaxation and corruption of a parasitic government. And for a good long while, he was content and faithful with his new home, even changing his name from Andrei Ryanovsky to a more westernized Andrew Ryan to better suit his new home. Being a smart and determined young man, with a stroke of luck, he quickly rose to be one of the wealthiest men in the country. Having first rose to wealth after he discovered oil on his property, he began investing his wealth wisely. His company, Ryan Oil, would make a grand fortune in not only the oil industry, but also in coal and in owning the second longest railroad in the country. At some point, he even purchased an expansive forest to serve as his own personal nature retreat. But it wouldn't be long until his love for his country began to falter. In response to the Great Depression in America, the 1930s would bring about government-ran social programming. This did not sit well with Ryan. Seeing this programming as the government spoon-feeding the lazy and undeserved of society, and even equating it to that of Russia's communism, referring to the programming as Bolsheviks' poison that was permeating into a once great nation. It was not long after this disillusionment towards his new homeland that those he labeled as parasites started to come after him directly. First it was the church. They approached him about his large forest and asked him to give it to the church because it should belong to God. Ryan obviously refused. It was his and he earned it, and no parasite would ever succeed in taking it from him. Then it was the government, attempting to bypass Ryan's stubbornness and instead nationalize the land and turn it into parkland, essentially ripping it from his fingers while he could do nothing about it. Ryan's stubborn adherence to his ideals refused to allow this, so instead of allowing his rightfully his land to be taken from him, he burnt the whole forest to the ground. If he can't have it, no one can. And it's this mentality that is going to be the backbone of my video on Ryan destroying the city of Rapture on purpose. So Ryan was obviously rather upset with the direction that his new country was going in, calling the government the New Dealers who were spoon-feeding Bolshevik poison to its people. His patriotism was quickly diminishing, and the final straw was soon to come. In 1939, World War II broke out, and I'm not going to go over the entire war, just a part of it that matters, which is the end of the war. The bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Ryan was at a point where he was considering the American government to be a collective of parasites, feeding on the wealthy to give to the poor, and the bombings were the straw that broke the camel's back. He saw this as the parasites using science and innovation to create a destructive force powerful enough that the parasites could destroy what they could not take. This led him to take drastic measures, knowing that nowhere that currently exists in the world would be somewhere that he could be free from the parasites. He would have to build something new, something better. He created shield companies that could hide his true ambition and use them to secretly construct a city under the waters of the Atlantic Ocean, somewhere between Greenland and Iceland. Before the city was even complete, Ryan started to move some of society's elites to his newfound paradise, the most renowned of artists, the most innovative of scientists, and the most shrewd of business tycoons. But realizing that you can't just have a city of elites, he brought in lower class peoples as well. After all, someone had to clean the toilets, fix the pipes, make the food, and serve the drinks. This created a very top-heavy society, essentially without a middle class. There were the haves and the have-nots. But the city was not just meant to be a paradise for the elites, it would be a shining example of capitalism, a truly free market where anybody could do anything to get whatever they wanted, which is the true theme of Bioshock. Objectivism. The philosophy that personal happiness and achievement was the only thing that mattered regardless of cost to others. But putting that aside for now, we can get into what happened in Rapture that eventually led to its downfall. The first thing I want to cover is the class separation and how this ties into the socio-economic structure of the city and its free market values. Being a truly free market, the city didn't bother with such trivial things such as labor laws, social support, or anything that caused any kind of market restriction. Essentially, this means that if you were one of the unlucky citizens that was working class, you got paid whatever the hell your boss deemed you worthy of being paid. Generally speaking, these wages ranged from practically nothing to almost something. This caused the working class to usually live at the bottom of the city towards the sea floor, where their homes were constantly half flooded from various leaks around the city, and unable to afford food or any kind of healthcare. Healthcare itself is a whole nother topic. I don't want to dive too deep into it because the doctors in Rapture were usually the kind that were not welcome to practice on the surface due to legal and ethical restraints, like, the stuff that stops patients from being experimented on. Make sure that the doctors do something that actually resembles some form of helping. But the reality for the working class was a bleak one, constantly sick, starving, living in an uninhabitable, festering hellscape of a slum. Crime and disease ran rampant, and life was miserable with there being almost no way to ascend to the top. However, in Ryan's eyes, this wasn't his problem, nor is it the city's problem. The city was built on a free market, and if you weren't happy with your position in life, the market was there to allow you to create your own wealth. And if you didn't, that's nobody's fault but your own. This left the lower class not only barely surviving, but also with no assistance, help, or even empathy from the government that put them there in the first place. Simply put, this was not a good time. The next major factor was the discovery of Adam and the invention of plasmids. One day, a lowly dock worker was bitten by a sea slug. The worker had a hand that was left permanently crippled after an incident in the war. However, the sea slug bite mended his hand back to perfect health miraculously quickly. This news reached the ears of one Bridget Tannenbaum, a genetic scientist who was, in her early days, sent to Auschwitz and survived due to her aiding and eventually working for the Nazi regime. She began to study the slugs and discovered they produced a compound she named Atom, a material that is capable of altering genetics. Heavy experimentation on the substance eventually led to realizing that in a purified form it could be turned into a new substance known as plasmids. These plasmids were able to give the user new abilities that were previously impossible to mankind, like telekinesis, pyrokinesis, electrokinesis, and a bunch more kinesis words, essentially being able to control things with their body and minds. Plasmids came with a price though. For starters, they were highly addictive. In addition to their addictive qualities, Atom was also somewhat akin to cancer within the body, replacing natural cells within the body with cells that were genetically manipulated by Atom. This caused users to deteriorate both mentally and physically, becoming what looked like zombies while they lost their minds and became violent lunatics. Those who heavily used plasmids eventually became known as splicers for their tendency to willingly splice their genes with synthetic coding. Now we can back up a little bit and look into the second villain of the Bioshock game, Frank Fontaine. We don't need the backstory of Fontaine, so we're going to mostly skip over it and just get into his actions in Rapture and how they affected the city as a whole. Fontaine was a conman and a criminal, always able to live comfortably outside of the law, and Rapture was to be a paradise for the immoral entrepreneur. Once he was in the city, he began a smuggling ring, bringing in contraband from the surface into the city, using submarines in the fishing docks to smuggle in items and also hire working-class individuals for what was, in Rapture standards, more than a fair wage. He became widely successful and influential figure in Rapture. In fact, he was approached by Bridget Tannenbaum after the dock worker was bitten by the sea slug, and he funded her research into Atom and launched a new company by the name of Fontaine Futuristics. He also created the Little Sisters Orphanage, which, although it seemed like it was in good intention, was built to supply Tannenbaum with little girls to use for her experiments into Atom. At first, everything was well. Ryan saw Fontaine Futuristics as exactly what he built Rapture for, a determined man creating a company to rise through society into the most elite of circles. But not everything Fontaine did was approved by Ryan. Fontaine ran various charitable organizations, most notably Fontaine's Home for the Poor, a shelter for those who were left destitute by Ryan's cutthroat free market he established within the city. Ryan also discovered that Fontaine first made his fortune by running illegal smuggling operations and began conducting a full-on investigation into them. Ryan kept trying to crack down on Fontaine's smuggling with increasing the consequences to the crime, eventually turning smuggling into a capital punishment with an immediate death penalty. This eventually culminated in a raid on Fontaine fisheries and put an end to the illegal enterprise where Fontaine was supposedly killed. Ryan's next step was a bold one. He moved to nationalize Fontaine Futuristics, the exact same thing that the American government attempted to do to his precious forest before he burnt the whole thing to the ground. This created a lot of problems in Rapture. It was against the very foundation of Rapture's ideology, the free market. Not only was Ryan killing people in the streets for their involvement with Fontaine's smuggling enterprise, he was claiming government ownership over a private corporation because not only was Fontaine gone, but he was Andrew Ryan, and he could. Ryan also put Rapture into complete lockdown. No one was to leave or enter or have any communication with the outside world. Combined with the nationalization of a private corporation, sprinkling in a heavy dose of isolation did not do well for the citizens of Rapture. Even before the isolation, the lack of sunlight was not doing any favors to the already deteriorating mental health of the citizens, which was not exactly slowed down when plasmids were thrown into the mix. To put it lightly, Rapture was a powder keg, and all it needed was its fuse lit, and a match was about to be struck. You see, Fontaine wasn't dead. He had faked his death to get Ryan off his back so he could focus on his real work, bringing Ryan down, without having to worry about Ryan hunting him in the process. He changed his identity and appearance to return as a new figure, Atlas. Atlas began by giving food and other provisions to the poor working class of Rapture and rallying them against the injustice of Ryan's top-heavy society, creating a massive rift in Rapture's citizens. It was no longer the elites and the working class, it was now those who sided with Ryan and those who sided with Atlas. But Ryan wasn't going to let this new parasite dethrone him from the top of his own city without a fight. And as we're about to see, Ryan went to some extremely drastic measures to ensure that he maintained his control over his own city. So this brings us to New Year's Eve 1958, the night of Rapture's downfall, the night the powder keg finally went off. On December 31st, 1958, Atlas led his followers on a series of attacks on Rapture's upper class. The first and hardest attack was on the Kashmir restaurant, one of the first places we as the player visit in the first Bioshock game. At the time, the restaurant was hosting a grand masquerade ball when Atlas's forces attacked and caused bloodshed. This caused the entire city to erupt into a full-scale civil war. The civil war led to a genetic arms race over plasmids, causing combat plasmids to spike in sales and development. People were trying to make themselves as powerful as possible to either win the war for their side or even just merely survive. As the development and consumption of plasmids skyrocketed, so did the demand for Atom, and the process of harvesting it from sea slugs was not enough to meet the demand. Ryan Industries, now also in control of Fontaine Futuristics, accelerated the Little Sister program to be able to harvest Atom from fallen splicers. But with Little Sisters wandering around collecting Atom, they became targets for splicers who needed to either level up or get their fix. So Ryan also had the Big Daddies created to act as bodyguards to keep the Little Sisters safe as they scavenged for Atom. Ryan also shut down all bathysphere travel, locked down the entire city, and restricted almost all access under a genetic code that allowed only him to control the city. I could go on for a while on all the exact details in the Rapture Civil War, but to sum it up, the whole city went to hell in a handbasket, and eventually the city was left crumbling and being roamed by the mentally insane with superhuman powers. But Ryan still had more tricks up his sleeve. He figured out how to use pheromones to control the mindless lunatic splicers. Not control entirely, but heavily influence them. Using the pheromones, he could attract them to specific areas, clear them out of areas, calm them, enrage them, essentially just steer their movements and emotional states. As we see in the game, he combines this pheromone mind control with the manipulation of the addiction of the splicers to get them to relentlessly hunt the player, offering a 10,000 Atom reward for the successful murder of Jack, the player character. Having realized that he was going to lose the war due to Atlas using the player character Jack to come after Ryan directly, he did take some pretty drastic measures to just straight up annihilate the city. The first thing he tried to do was to kill the city by depriving it of its oxygen, by burning down all of the trees that produce the oxygen, just suffocate everybody inside. This plan, of course, was stopped by the player character in the events of Bioshock 1, but that still wasn't the last card that Ryan had to play. Moments before his death, Ryan also initiated a self-destruct sequence on the power core that supplied power to the entire city, which would have shut down all of the pumps that fed oxygen or kept water out of the city, and essentially would have also just suffocated the city, blown it into hell, and just ruined it entirely. Again, this was stopped by Jack, the player character, and those inside of Rapture were allowed to continue living. If you can call that living. So let's take another step back and let's just take an overall look at all of this. This game paints this as a power dichotomy. The elite is trying to maintain order and the intended way of life within the city, and the downtrodden trying to bring it all down. And as much as this is not inaccurate, like that is what's happening, there is a lot more to what Ryan does within the city. First of all, Rapture wasn't built to provide a paradise for the free market. Rapture was built to give an empire to an emperor. Rapture was a lot of things, but above all else, it was Ryan's. Even when we enter the lighthouse before we actually descend into the city, we are met with a large banner that reads, "No gods or kings, only man." And this banner is hanging underneath a colossal statue of the one and only Andrew Ryan. Not only did this city belong to him, but much like the forest, if he can't have it, no one can. As for Ryan destroying it on purpose, there's a lot of information in the game that supports this. The most important thing to Ryan in the city was not just making sure the city survived, but also that he remained at its top. Early on in my narrative about the city, we saw evidence of Ryan going to extreme lengths to maintain his image of the city. One could do anything they wanted within its walls as long as it did not interfere with Ryan, and if it did, Ryan would intervene. Intervention was not required on a large scale until Fontaine came into the picture, and it's in this interaction that we see the true intent of Ryan in regards to the city. In a true free market, the kingpin is whoever has the most power, influence, and money in the market. Ryan built the city, controlled the comings and goings, and controlled who was admitted into the city and what was admitted into the city. Ryan did not have a financial monopoly on Rapture. He had a managerial monopoly, meaning that as long as his control wasn't threatened, no amount or money or success by anyone in the city could dethrone him. The free market and his position at the top was safe as long as he held the only keys to the front door. That was the problem with Fontaine. It wasn't his Fontaine Futuristics that bothered Ryan. It wasn't his money or success. It was his smuggling. Doesn't matter how much you control the front door if everything and everyone is getting in through the back. Fontaine's smuggling operation was the only thing that threatened Ryan's position at the top of the city. Fontaine could double or even triple Ryan's net worth, and as long as Ryan still had his control, Fontaine would still be beneath him, still just be another subordinate in Ryan's kingdom of Rapture. Fontaine's quick rise to wealth and steady leeching of Ryan's control within Rapture was the only threat to Ryan's position of the Emperor. Ryan had to do something. Rapture had to be his. Fontaine's social programming to aid those in the working class was just adding insult to injury by not only threatening Ryan's power, but also actively going against his ideals and visions for the city. Mutiny was becoming a strong possibility, so Ryan started punishing those involved with the smuggling, even executing them in the streets and displaying their remains as a warning. When that didn't stop the mutiny, he had to go even further and launch a full-scale attack, which he did, and he thought he successfully killed Fontaine. But just because Fontaine was dead doesn't mean the power was solved. The seeds of mutiny had already been planted. Ryan needed to add to his control. With the rising influence of plasmids among the citizens, he saw that as the best way to achieve keeping his managerial monopoly on the city. He nationalized Fontaine Futuristics, giving him uncontested ownership over all plasmids and Atom. This returned him to his position at the top, and for a while, he was again the ruler of the city. By controlling plasmids, it gave him economical control. By controlling the largest company in the market, he essentially controlled the market. But not only that, he also controlled the substance supply to what was an ever-growing number of Atom junkies. This regained control didn't last forever, though, because Fontaine was back with a new alter ego, Atlas. With the rise of a disgruntled population and the looming threat of a violent resistance, he had to go even further to maintain his control, locking the city with nothing and no one going in or out. If anyone wanted to do anything, they had to go through Ryan. As we already covered in the story of the city's fall, this didn't work either, but he went to extreme lengths to make sure he controlled the city. He even locked the city with a genetic key, meaning that you had to have Ryan's DNA to access anything in the city. Even after the war broke out, his use of little sisters and big daddies was just another attempt to gain control over the city. The genetic arms race that was fueled by the Civil War made one thing very clear. If you controlled the Atom, you controlled everything. When Ryan created the Big Daddies to protect the Little Sisters, it wasn't to keep the Little Sisters safe, it was to keep the Atom from getting into Fontaine's hands. And this would have succeeded if it wasn't for the player character Jack. Ryan had full control over the Atom, the splicers, the security systems, the doors, the bathyspheres, all of it locked behind a gate that can only be opened with his DNA. And it was working. Until Jack, Ryan's illegitimate child, was introduced to the picture and able to move freely through the city by having Ryan's DNA, it created a situation that Ryan wasn't prepared for. If the player character did not come to Rapture, Ryan probably would have won. When Ryan realized that Jack was going to be the final blow that toppled his control over the city, he made a couple last attempts to maintain his control. Kill the trees, kill the city, burn down the forest. But even when that didn't work, he tried to destroy the city another way by trying to overload the power core that supplied power to the entire city, just self-destruct the city. And when all was lost and he no longer had any control over the city, and Jack was in his office ready to kill him and death was staring him in the face, he didn't just accept his fate, he took control of it. Using the mind control that Atlas had over Jack, he ordered his own death. The city had fallen, his control had slipped, all was lost. The only thing he still had was his death, and he was not going to allow Atlas to have it. If he can't have it, no one can. So, did Ryan destroy the city on purpose? Yes and no. Did he want it destroyed? No. But destroying it was better than letting anyone but him have it. Rapture was probably doomed as soon as plasmids hit the market. The toll the plasmids took on the minds and bodies of the citizens was too heavy for the city to survive long term. But it was Ryan's stubborn inability to relinquish even a morsel of control that caused it to fall so quickly and spectacularly. The fall of the city was a methodical and deliberate response to forces that threatened his authority. And I know I've said it a bunch already and you're probably sick of hearing it, but it all boils down to, if he can't have it, no one can. So I want to thank you very much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. If I can figure out how, I'm going to be putting a card on the screen right here to steer towards what is currently my only other video. I've been having a lot of fun making these videos, and if there's a topic you'd like me to make a video on, please let me know in the comments. As it says on my channel, I am sane, I am a nerd, I play video games, and I make videos on the video games I play. So if you request a topic and it's for a video game that I have no interest in playing, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do it. But thank you so much for joining me in my journey through Rapture and giving me a reason to play these games again. They really are some of my favorite games of all time, except Bioshock 2. Like, it's just not as good. It's not bad, but it's not really good. So with that, that's all I have for you today. I am sane. Thank you for watching, and would you kindly like, comment, and subscribe. Peace out.